Every year after World's Strongest Man, in the comments, in forums, in our videos, everywhere you look, there's people saying, it's strongman, not fast man, it's getting too light, it should be about strength, not about speed. So being the strongman data nerd that she is, Auntie Liz has delved deep into the data to find out exactly if it is getting lighter or heavier. Auntie Liz, show us your stats.
Before we get into it then, we can't possibly cover the whole of Strongman. So we are just going to look at the World's Strongest Man specifically. It's the longest running competition, so it's the easiest for us to make those comparisons on.
Sure.
I've chosen select events that we still commonly see today.
Okay.
So we're going to be looking at the super yoke, farmer's walk, loading, deadlift for reps, squat for reps, and log for reps. It has to be for reps. We cannot look at max weight because...
Atlas stones?
Yes, and Atlas stones. Of course the Atlas stones, although they weren't always Atlas stones, so stones I've called it, because we've also got the McGlashan stones, which they first used in 1986. But yeah, you can't look at a max weight because it's a max weight, like what people lift.
Well, I think to be fair on max weight events, you know, the strength was very, very good back in the early days of Strongman.
Yeah.
Obviously, certain events like the log, athletes are a lot more well trained on those type of movements these days.
You can't really compare the numbers, and honestly, some of the equipment that they use. So a good example, 1977 World's Strongest Man, the max deadlift was literally a car with no handles or anything. It wasn't on a frame, and they would stand on this plinth and just try and pick the car up, either sort of facing away, facing towards it. You didn't like, there was no real lockout. It was just crazy. But that was the max deadlift, and how on earth do you measure that? So there are some things as we go through them. There are a couple of, you have to take it with a pinch of salt, but I've collected the data as best as I can.
Let's see what you've got.
All right, I've got some really ugly line graphs is what I've got, because I thought that's a really good way to make this really visual and easy to follow. Then I remembered I have not made a line graph since secondary school. So apologies in advance. Here's my lovely graph then, Lozzie.
That is incredible.
Thank you so much. Now, the way I've done it, if it's in, I've used it whether or not it's in the heats or the final, and I've just taken the heaviest set. So say it's in both, but it was heavier in the final, I've taken the heaviest set of finals that they use that year. And I've done that across all of the events. So you can clearly see here that it's not linear at all. It sort of goes up and up and up. In 2004, they had an almost freakishly heavy set compared to what they've been using previously. It went up to 160 kilos. Then it came back down again. Then it went back up in 2009 and 2010. But 2010 is the last time that we saw farmers walk as a traditional, just a run backwards and forwards. Since then, it's only ever been used as part of a medley or in 2020 heats when they did it for distance.
Interesting. Obviously, we do have some competitions where we have the frame as well. But this is just solely focusing on the farmer's walk. Yeah. And I can't believe once we had farmers that were 75 kilos.
Yeah, so the first time we saw them in 1983, they were like little logs, actually. You know, the way that they used to get a log, cut the handles into it. It was very similar to that. So they've really developed. And then through the 90s, like late 90s, they used the same set. It was like, they looked like bullets almost. Do you remember the ones? And they had different colours on them. They were like cylinders.
Oh, yeah. No, I do. Yeah, sorry. I was thinking of the anvil ones that they used as well.
Ah, yes.
But yes, I remember now.
And they used like some milk churn ones before where they had to go through and had a step. I think that was the year Jamie Reeves one.
Yeah, those look nasty as well. Tiny little handles.
Yes, yeah. Almost like Dinny Stone handles or something. They were like little rings, weren't they? Oh, and I've just thrown a few names in here just for people that are newer to the sport so they can see whose era it was, if you like. So just the names listed here are who won that year.
So there we go with the farmer's walk. Started off with 80 kilos as our original weight. We're up at the 150, 155 kilos seems to be the standard weight at World's Strongest Man. We have been heavier though.
Yes.
160 kilos is the top weight we've seen on farmer's walk at World's Strongest Man. I know from experience and obviously watching, there is heavier competitions with farmer's walks in. But World's Strongest Man, max weight 160. Has come down a little bit.
Yeah, it's come down a little bit.
But it's certainly been heavier than it used to be.
Oh, God, yes.
Event number 2 is the loading race. And just looking at this graph, I am in shock by how light some of these are.
Yeah, so this is quite a funny one. Now, just to be clear of what data I've used here, for a loading race, I've made sure it's at least 3 implements that they've had to load, because loading is often used as part of a medley, but sometimes it was just 1 or 2 and then it's a drag and a wheelbarrow carrier stuff. I've not included those loads. This is more proper loading races. Okay. I've excluded 1990s loading race, which was an anvil load onto barrels, because it was much more similar to an Atlas stone run than it was a loading race. Okay. But other than that, this is your data. And yeah, I mean, I don't even know what to say. I mean, we first saw loading at World's Strongest Man in 1983, and it was respectable enough weights, because back then they were loading 10 or 12 implements. But 1985, they were loading cages with rocks in, and they weighed 25 kilos each. Now, personally, my suitcases when we travel weigh about that.
I've just got vivid memories of Grizzly doing this event, or not really doing this event.
Iconic.
He was like, yeah, sod this one, boys. You can have knocked yourselves out.
Yes.
Could you imagine if they did that now?
Oh my goodness.
Imagine Brian Shaw looking at these 25 kilo cages.
Imagine any of them.
They'd be throwing them.
Yeah, they would. They would be launching them into space. Yeah. But as you can see, it's gone up. It went up massively after that, obviously. And it's steadily gone up since. We had one considerably heavier loading implement in 2015 in the Malaysia World's Strongest Man.
I remember that.
Those were those stupid tyres. And I say stupid because they didn't look heavy.
They weren't big, but they were dense and horrible and awkward.
Yeah. And one thing you really have to consider with loading is that the awkwardness of the implements varies greatly year to year. And also so does the height of the platforms that they're loading to. In the last 10 years in particular, it's been much, much higher than previous years.
Yeah. So this year it has come down a little bit on previous years, but the athletes had to do an extra implement.
They did. So 3 was quite normal, 3 implements at a time, and then 4 was standard. But this year they had to do 5. So there's always factors that you have to consider.
Yeah, loading is one of those events where objects do differ all the time, can be more awkward. The distance that they have to run, and at World's Strongest Man, sometimes they're running on sand. That can be a big factor. Even occasionally in water as well.
I was going to say, a lot of these earlier ones where it was lighter, they were going into like a lagoon in Iceland where it was absolutely freezing cold, or they're running into a lake or on the beach.
Well, we all remember 2010.
Oh,
Strongest Man.
You don't forget a thing like that. Obviously, Zadrunas was drowning and Brian dropped his sack into the sand. It was a disaster.
Crazy times. Yes. So the third event we're looking at is the Atlas Stones. The iconic Atlas Stones gets talked about many, many times. Are the Atlas Stones getting lighter, Auntie Liz?
Not really, is the answer there. So they were first introduced at World's Strongest Man in 1986. So this was 9 years after the competition started. It wasn't one of the original events in the competition. And back then they used the McGlashan stones, and the top weight at the time was 150 kilos for the 5th stone. The lightest, so that's the weight that I've used, is always the weight of the 5th or final stone, if you like. The lightest ever was 127 kilos in 1994.
Well, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going by what the commentators saying, because they often didn't have the, graphics on the screen or anything like that. So to do the research for this, I've literally sat there and watched the events and listened to what's being said. So, take it with a pinch of salt perhaps, but we do know a lot of this to be correct. So you can see that it jumps up, and for a few years it was 160 was the weight of the 5th stone, then it went up to 180, then for a couple of years it was 186 before quite a considerable leap to 210. Now I should point out, in the 2012 competition, Atlas stones were only in the heats, not in the final. They used natural stones that year. And this year is the first year that they came down. Now they came down to 200 kilos, but obviously they added in the walk-in element, which we used to have at World's Strongest Man. Now I should also point out that back in the day when they first started doing these, it wasn't tiered platforms. That didn't come in until the 90s. They were waist-height barrels, and they literally threw them on. They just launched them, sometimes from a distance. Do you remember Magnus Ver Magnusson in 1991?
Jean-Paul Sigmarsson, film video of him just launching them on.
Yeah, they weren't controlling them onto the platform or anything.
It was the late 90s through the 2000s where they had the tiered kind of higher platforms that, really challenged the shorter guys a little bit more. The more recent platforms have been brought down slightly, but they're all a fairly good height rather than an extremely high first one. I think there's footage of certain athletes. Well, just certain. I don't know if it was a Stumpy.
He literally couldn't reach the top one from what I remember.
I remember Gary Taylor struggling. It wasn't on Atlas Stones, but that was a really high platform or something. Yeah, so a little bit more fair in terms of height, but they've added the run back in this year, so the actual weight of that last one has come down slightly.
That's right. And just to see how that affected the results this year. So this year, out of the 10 athletes doing the Atlas Stones, only 5 were able to do all 5. Last year, it was also 5 with a slightly heavier weight, but also they didn't have the run in. Only 3 athletes completed all 5 stones in 2020. 7 of them managed it in 2019. But that year, there was only 5 events in the final. So obviously they would have been a bit fresher because in surrounding years, they've done 6.
There's a lot of factors that come into World's Strongest Man. The events that you do beforehand are obviously going to have an impact. The weather has a big impact. How humid it is can really affect stones.
Yeah, stones in particular because of the tacky issues. And we keep seeing it at World's Strongest Man, don't we?
We like to have World's Strongest Man in really hot climates.
So I think it's fair to say that while it's not completely linear, it is steadily going up.
Yeah, you see that sort of, it kind of steady and then it goes up and then it kind of comes down slightly, steadies off, goes up. And it comes to see that repeat formula on almost every event that we've looked at so far.
Yeah.
So next up we're looking at log for reps, a very traditional strongman event in recent years. But the first time we had log for reps at World's Strongest Man was only 1993. Previous to that, it was always a max event.
That's right. And the first few years that we did have it, it was incline log for reps. So the athletes would be stood at a slight lean, like leaning up against a platform or something. Yeah. And the lightest weight we've seen at World's Strongest Man in those early years was 105 kilos. So that one's made quite a steady progress upwards. I know one standout performance that you really love, Lozzie, was 2011 in the World's Strongest Man final when Zydrunas hit 155 kilos for 10 reps.
Yeah, that was an amazing performance. I was just kind of like, when you said 105 kilo on an incline press,
I know.
I think the athletes would go nuts if they saw that today.
Well, they were doing about 20 reps back then.
Yeah.
So can you imagine what they'd be doing now? they would go nuts.
I mean, looking at that graph, obviously the weights have come down. Yeah. But could you imagine if we saw 105 kilos? We've got women under 80 kilo athletes that can do that.
Yeah. Some of the lower weight class women are doing weights like that. So the absolute heaviest log that we've had at World's Strongest Man for reps is actually only 158 kilos, which is much lighter than, say, something like the Arnold's. But it's a very different competition, as we know, and it's a much longer format too. So that was in the 2017 World's Strongest Man heats, because in the final, I don't think any of us will forget they had a Viking press as the overhead.
It's clear to see, though, the last 3 years, the weights on the log has come down.
Yeah. Now, I did wonder if 145 this year was so a couple of people wouldn't zero. Is that unfair? Am I being mean? Is that unfounded?
It's not the first time you'll see that. I mean, you see, what we do see is when World's Strongest Man split from IFSA in 2004, you do see a little dip in numbers around that area where the weights were going up and up and up, the standard was getting great, and then you get a couple of athletes that then went off to IFSA and they brought the standard down a little bit just to make sure
everyone
athletes
could do it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Organisers will look at the level of competition, how many competitions they've had back to that.
Yeah.
What the conditions are like. You know, it does end up being challenging. I've been in competitions where sometimes you think it looks a bit easier on paper.
But you put it all together and it's
really a tough competition. So it's not always the case. And being heavier isn't necessarily always better, as I can testify from my yoke experience in 2019. So speaking of yokes, I can already see that super peak of my terrifying experience on what used to be my favourite event.
I know.
But take us back to the start. When did we first see the super yoke in World's Strongest Man and what weight was it?
So we first saw the yoke in 1995 and back then it weighed 300 kilos. I don't know if you remember it. It looked like Lego. Do you remember?
Yes.
It was like multicoloured bright Lego pieces. I'm sure it wasn't made of Lego, but that's what it looked like. They did 300 kilos for 2 years and then randomly put it up to 400 kilos. That clearly didn't work out, so they brought the weight back down again. And since then, it's made steady progress upwards. Now, 500 kilos is the most that we've seen at World's Strongest Man in a standalone yoke race. And that was in 2015 World's Strongest Man final. However, that weight was made up of people. It wasn't actual weight. So, you know, I don't know. Like I said, sometimes you have to take it with a little bit of a pinch of salt. The absolute heaviest, obviously, was 600 kilos in the 2019 World's Strongest Man heats. It was only for a couple of meters, though, because it was part of a medley.
There was a couple of meters too many.
It was in your case, Dave. So every yoke that we've seen at World's Strongest Man since 2019 has been part of a medley. So it's been into either a frame carry, or there's been the box carry, or something else.
I think those weights are pretty good for yoke. I think 500 kilos as a standalone weight is perfect for World's Strongest Man level, and 1,000 pounds works well as part of a medley. 300 kilos, definitely too light.
Far too light, yeah. And you know, people can say it's light, but is 1,000 pounds ever light under any circumstances?
When you see the speed that some of the guys can go compared to others,
like...
you get a good mixture.
Yeah.
It's not like everyone is sprinting with that kind of weight.
No.
So next up, another staple of World's Strongest Man in modern years, the deadlift for reps. But 1997 was the first time we ever saw the deadlift for reps at World's Strongest Man. Prior to that, it was a multitude of different max type deadlift events.
It was.
We've seen them lifting cheese, we've seen them lifting cars, we've seen them lifting all sorts of weird contraptions.
Yeah. And also, something that was really popular, especially in the 90s, was the deadlift hold. Rather than actually doing a deadlift for reps. But yeah, it's almost unbelievable. 1997 was the first time we saw deadlift for reps at Worlds. Now, a lot of the time on this event, it's a car deadlift on a frame. So, which is a little bit frustrating because obviously we don't know for certain the weights. It does vary quite a lot depending on pivot points. It could be much harder, much easier, etc. And also, really annoyingly, I couldn't include one of my favourite deadlift events, which is the barrel deadlift, where they load the barrel after each rep. And obviously that's because they're only doing one rep at each weight, and it starts as light as about 260 kilos. So I couldn't include it for data purposes because they weren't repping it out.
Fair enough. So what have you got?
Right, the first year, I mean, the commentator said that the car deadlift weighed 1,110 kilos. So
sounds legit.
Yeah, so I take it. I mean, it was around about 320, maybe as low as 300 kilos that year. It did make steady progress upwards, as you can see, with the absolute heaviest deadlift being in the 2018 World's Strongest Man final. And again, then it was a car deadlift, but it was listed as 386 kilos.
Okay.
So then the weight started dropping down in 2019 and 20, but both of those years, they didn't do a deadlift for reps in the finals. It was only in the heats, because in the 2019 final, they did squat for reps, and in the 2020 final, they did the 18-inch max deadlift.
Yes, they did, yep.
So it has started creeping up again a little bit. And again, it's a trend that we're quite used to seeing now. It sort of goes up, it comes down, it goes up, it comes down.
It seems to be a very common trait that it kind of comes up, comes down a little bit. It just kind of works in waves.
And it does slowly go up, but obviously there's a little bit of up and down within that as well.
So obviously, like you say, on the deadlift, it's very hard to kind of track this accurately because the deadlift varies so much, and we do see a mix. You know, sometimes it's a max deadlift, sometimes an 18-inch max deadlift, sometimes it's a car, sometimes it's the barrels, sometimes it's an axle. It changes all the time, but we know the athletes are getting stronger at deadlifting. We've seen that, you know, clearly over the years. The one thing I will say, to give the older guys credit, there is advancements not just in kind of the training philosophies and stuff like that, but in the actual equipment that guys use, the straps that they use, the suits that they use, the bars that they use, all allow athletes to lift more these days than the likes of Jeff Capes and Sigmason and Kaz and those guys that set the path back in the day. So we have to kind of give credit to what those guys did in the early days.
Definitely.
So your final graph is another one of my favourites, the squat for reps. When did we first see the squat for reps at World's Strongest Man?
So again, just like the deadlift, I can't use one of my favourites, which was the barrel loading squat, because obviously the weight changes with each rep that they do. So 2001 was the first time we saw a standard like on a bar squat for reps, and we have seen some very funny squats at World's Strongest Man. I mean, one of the earliest ones that they did, they had two women, I mean the slimmest women you've ever seen, to be fair, and they were in like bird cages, and it was on a Smith machine. And the range of motion also.
I remember seeing that. I also remember seeing the Playboy squat with Kazmaier with the platform above his head, and he swears he never looked up once.
So for the 20-ish years that we've had squat for reps at World's Strongest Man, this is one event that hasn't really progressed. It hasn't got lighter per se, but it's come back to the normal weights. So 318.5 kilos is the most popular weight for squat for reps at World's Strongest Man, because I guess it's a nice round 700 pounds.
Yeah.
The heaviest squat for reps we've had was in 2019 finals when it was 340 kilos. But yeah, this is one that, I mean, we don't see it as often as we would probably like on a barbell, but...
It's interesting that 2019 competition was when they only had 5 events in the final.
So the events were a bit heavier, yeah. So it's that balancing act, isn't it?
And squatting 700 pounds for reps is very challenging. I've been there against the best in the world. It's a weight these days the guys can get double figures in, especially the top guys, and that can be draining.
Yeah, it can.
Doing that many reps for on that kind of weight, it can take it out of you as you go on to the next events. The other thing with squatting, and one of the reasons it's always difficult...
It's dangerous.
It's dangerous, but it's also hard to judge.
Yeah.
It's one of those events that athletes kind of manipulate the machines or the bars as much as possible.
Yeah.
Getting solid depth on squat becomes an issue. So that is an issue. Well, it's one of the reasons you don't see the squat as often as you might see the deadlift in a strongman competition. Deadlift is much easier. You just watch the athlete lift it from A to B. But with the squat, there's a lot more variables. You've got people around kind of covering you, whereas on a deadlift you don't need any spotters. You don't need as much equipment. Visually it looks a little bit better. So I think that's one of the reasons a squat we don't see as much. But yeah, you can really see with that one it hasn't varied too much from 2001 to 2022. The weight is the same. It'll be interesting to see if we do see heavier squats in the future, because if you think of the Arnolds this year, there were some ridiculous numbers lifted there. The modern athletes know how to squat. They all train it hard. I'd like to see it. I think the squat is a big test of strength, and I'd certainly like to see it pushed maybe a little bit more.
Yeah, maybe up to like 330 kilos is a nice weight.
Sounds good.
Not for me, but for them. So there we go then, Lelsey. That is all the data that I have. Sorry, my graphs aren't very pretty.
Well, I'll give you A for effort with the graphs.
Thanks.
It's an interesting thing to look at, because people talk about the fact that strongman is getting lighter, and when you look at the graphs, you see it does go up and down. It's certainly much heavier than the early competitions.
Absolutely.
But we have to, looking at the data, in recent years, the weight has dropped slightly.
Yeah.
And there could be a number of reasons for that. Strongman isn't just about a max lift. We do see plenty of max lifts in strongman competitions, but you need that ability to throw. You need the ability to move quickly. You need the ability to do many things and be an all-round superhero. That's what these guys are all about. When I started watching strongman in the early 90s, I guess, is when I first started watching it, I didn't even care what the weight was. It was the visual. Yeah. The visual looked impressive. These guys were big, huge, strong powerhouses, and it was that visual that really meant something. It's only us die-hard fans that care so much about the weights.
Yeah, it really is, to be fair. And, for anyone who's quite new to the sport and thinks, well, if it's the strongest man, then they shouldn't even be running and doing this, I implore you to go back and watch the early World's Strongest Man competitions, because back then they were tyre tossing for distance. Just a normal tyre. I could get you one off my car right now. It wasn't a special adaptive tyre. They were tyre tossing. They were wrist rolling. They did
bar bending.
Yes, they did a keg, a sort of barrel lift, and it maxed out at about 200 pounds, which is 90 kilos. It has progressed a lot, but moving with weight, running, it's always been a part of strongman, but that's why we love it, because it's so entertaining. Looking
at these graphs there, as long as we never see those 25 kilo cages,
we have to draw a line somewhere.
I'll be happy enough. I love seeing strongman of all different abilities. It's entertaining, it's fun, it's dynamic. I love the heavy events, I love the speed events, I love the whole variety of it. It's what makes it interesting for me, the fact that you have to be good at everything. And if you don't like the World's Strongest Man format, there's the Arnold Classic, there's the one-day shows, there's lots and lots of awesome different strongman competitions out there
that test in different ways.
Absolutely. And the best guys, they win them all. Right guys, we hope you enjoyed this little delve into the data on some of the traditional strongman events. Do you think strongman is getting too light? Let us know in the comments below. Are you enjoying seeing the events as they are currently? We love it regardless.
Yeah, just love the sport, love the people, just love it, love it.
Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll catch you guys next time.